Hello everyone and welcome to today's learning session, Supplementing REDD Plus with Biodiversity Payments, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns and I'm a Program Officer for Learning and Communications. Our presenter today is Jonah Busch, a Research Fellow at the Center for Global Development. And before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips and reminders. And for those of us who have joined us for previous webinars, you have heard this before, but please bear with me. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you can access the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To find the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forestclimate and look for the REDD learning section. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers or you can dial in through the number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you have audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this is sometimes caused by having too many internet applications open, so feel free to close some of them and that usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join us by phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send me or Jenny Guzman a message via the chat section if possible, and we will try to sort it out. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit your questions for Jonah through the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. For anything that we don't have time to cover, you're invited to post them online to our REDD Plus learning platform, reddcommunity.org. After the webinar, you'll receive a link to the place on the website where you can post your questions. And we will also post a recording of the session and a PDF of this presentation there, so you can access it after this presentation. Thank you again for joining us today, and with that we'll get started and I will turn it over to Jonah. Jonah.
Thank you, Breen, and thank you, Jenny, and thank you, WWF. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the webinar. Excited to be with you this morning to talk about supplementing REDD Plus with biodiversity payments. The overview of the presentation that I'll give today is shown here. I'll be discussing who the Center for Global Development is. That's my organization. I'll discuss briefly the importance of forests and REDD. I recognize some familiar names from the attendees, and so I know that most of you are already familiar with forests and REDD. I'll be talking about one of many non-carbon benefits that REDD can produce, and that's biodiversity. And I'll be talking of one of many ways that that benefit can be achieved, which is supplemental payments. And I'll talk about how making these supplemental payments has a paradoxical bonus that's a little bit unexpected and intriguing, and that's that in some circumstances paying for biodiversity can actually achieve more carbon than paying for carbon at the same cost. So I'll explain why that is. And everything that I'll be sharing today is based on a paper that you see here that was published in Land Economics last year, called Supplementing REDD with Biodiversity Payments, the Paradox of Paying for Multiple Ecosystem Services. And you can see at the bottom of the slide a web link to the ungated version of that paper. So my institution, the Center for Global Development, is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C. We focus on international development, but in a somewhat different way than many organizations, which is that we focus on what the rich countries and powerful institutions should be doing to make lives better for poor people in developing countries. So this is encouraging generous aid programs, but it extends beyond that to also include open migration policies, fair trade practices, and ambitious climate policies. And I'm part of a new initiative at the Center for Global Development called Tropical Forests for Climate and Development. Our goal is to mobilize substantial additional finance from high-income countries to conserve tropical forests in order to slow climate change. And some of you may know Frances Seymour, the former Director General of C4. She's my colleague here, as is Michelle de Nevers, who was involved with the climate investment funds at the World Bank, and several other colleagues as well. So why are we interested in forests? Forests provide many goods and services to people in the developing world. They provide sources of income. They provide food. They contribute to the production of energy. They contribute to human health and human safety in all of the ways you see here, which are all components of sustainable development. And as we all know, forests also contribute to global public goods that benefit everyone in the world, whether you live near a forest or not. So they contribute to habitat for plants and animals, and they store carbon. And when forests are cleared and burned, they release carbon, and that contributes to global warming. About 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by deforestation, according to the most recent estimates. And so if anyone is concerned about climate change, they should be interested in REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And you see in the blue and the green the primary setup of how REDD would be organized through the UNFCCC since 2000, discussed since 2005, and pretty much finalized last year, December 2013, in Warsaw. So tropical forest countries would undertake policies and measures for reducing deforestation, for conserving forests. This would produce carbon benefits, and there would be compensation, payment for performance that is contingent upon those carbon benefits being realized. And that would be monetary benefits coming to the country. Now, in addition to these carbon benefits and monetary benefits, there are also non-carbon benefits. And when people talk about non-carbon benefits, they're sometimes talking about different things. So some forest communities, for instance, are interested in the non-carbon benefits that could come along with the policies for conserving forests, like clarifying land tenure or providing local livelihoods and forest monitoring. Then other people might be interested in the non-carbon benefits that come from maintaining forest cover, like biodiversity habitat or the ecosystem services that I showed on the last page. So non-carbon benefits is a funny word, so just a quick aside, if you've been following this topic for a while, you may have heard about co-benefits, and then there were objections to that term with people thinking that it makes these other benefits like livelihoods take a back seat to carbon. So there was the phrase multiple benefits put forward, but the purpose of the convention, the UNFCCC, is really about stopping climate change with carbon. So this sort of diminishes the role of carbon, and so we ended up with the UNFCCC talking about carbon and non-carbon benefits. And it's sort of an inartful term, but you know, the least objectionable to the least number of people. So there we go, non-carbon benefits. And for the remainder of the talk, we'll be focusing on just one non-carbon benefit of REDD, which is increased habitat for biodiversity, like this gorilla here. But much of what I say can translate to other forest ecosystem services as well, such as water provision. So how to achieve biodiversity benefits from REDD in addition to carbon benefits? Well, the simplest way, the most obvious way, is in fact to do nothing. And simply by conserving forests for their carbon will result in more forests, and those forests have more habitat for more biodiversity. So REDD in itself is already good for biodiversity. Now, to increase these benefits further, we know that there are safeguards that have been introduced to the UNFCCC, for instance, to avoid converting natural forest to oil palm and claiming that it's still a forest. There have been proposals for multi-conditional programs or integral programs that are not only about carbon but are about many services at the same time. And there have been proposals to target REDD activities toward high biodiversity forests in particular. And I'll come back and I'll talk about some of these, but what I really would like to talk about and explain is making supplemental payments. And I should clarify that this is a proposal that's been around for a while. You can see it proposed in many people's writing. And so this isn't a new concept by any means that I'm proposing here. But what is new in this research is this paradoxical and happy effect that this type of payments can have. So what does this mean, supplementing REDD with biodiversity payments? How would this work? This would be taking the existing institutional infrastructure that's being built for REDD and just using it to do something a little bit extra, which is make payments for biodiversity. So I mentioned that from 2005 to 2013, there have been 8 years of international negotiations on REDD to agree to the rules. There have been several years developing the carbon fund of the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, bilateral agreements, years in development, voluntary carbon markets, the rules for which, years in development. And all of these have monitoring, reporting, and verification systems in place for deforestation and for carbon. They have reference levels that will have international legitimacy. They have safeguards that have been intensely negotiated. They have systems of accounting and governance capable of channeling billions of dollars of international finance, all for the purpose of making payments for forests in the form of dollars per ton of CO2. Now, this same system can be used with almost no modification to pay for forests for their biodiversity value with the unit of dollars per biodiversity value per hectare. And this could be, for example, dollars per endemic species per hectare, to give one example. Why? What would be the purpose of supplementing REDD with biodiversity payments? From the point of view of a biodiversity conservation group, this would steer a potentially vast new source of demand for forest conservation, REDD+, toward high biodiversity forests. And it could do so with far lower transaction costs and startup costs than standalone projects for biodiversity, which would have to replicate all of these monitoring, reference levels, safeguards, finance on their own. So in addition to all of that investment that's already being put in place, there's only 3 additional necessary steps in order for supplementary payments for biodiversity to occur. One would be a registry identifying the geographical origin of emission reductions. This would allow potential buyers to assess which reductions are from forests that are especially valuable for biodiversity. And registries are something that many of these REDD systems are setting up anyway. Second, a facility to consolidate demand for the biodiversity benefit of avoided deforestation, demand from many small and geographically dispersed potential buyers. So an organization like the Global Environment Facility or like the World Wildlife Fund, to put my hosts on the spot, could create a fund that would make supplementary payments for biodiversity. And finally, a standardized accepted system for geographically differentiating forests' relative biodiversity value. And this would relieve individual buyers of the private cost of gathering and analyzing this information. So in the examples that I'll show from the paper, these were based on the richness of endemic forest species, how many forest species live in one country's forests and nowhere else. But a metric for biodiversity could be based on the presence of charismatic flagship species. It could be weighted by the rarity of the occurrence of species in a particular forest. Or I saw an interesting proposal from Corey Bradshaw recently. It could be primary forest. But what this metric of biodiversity should not be is something that varies as forest cover patterns change. So something like interior forest would not be a very good metric for paying for biodiversity, because what is in interior forest in one year is no longer interior forest in the next year as forests are cleared. So where would the money come from? And I should state at this point that when this idea was conceived, it looked possible, even likely, that there could be tens of billions of dollars a year coming for REDD. We know that for the next few years, we're no longer in that world. We're looking at a few hundred millions of dollars a year for REDD, and we can be optimistic that by 2020, maybe that order of magnitude of funding will be on the table again. So there's less money for REDD, but that also means that the money that could become available for biodiversity payments would be larger in relative terms to the carbon money. Two possible sources of where biodiversity funding could come from. The first would be existing buyers of REDD carbon payments making a premium payment for biodiversity. Many surveys of voluntary market REDD buyers indicate that that these buyers are willing to pay a price premium for biodiversity, although one study that I saw of markets did not actually find that this price premium occurred in practice. Whether or not buyers of REDD credits are willing to pay a price premium or not, the amount of funding from premium payments for biodiversity would be fundamentally constrained in volume by how much is being paid for REDD carbon credits. So perhaps even more promising than this, I would see matching payments from a distinct pool of buyers who are not already buying carbon per se, but would be willing to match carbon payments with payments for the biodiversity value of conserving forests. You may know that currently international expenditures on biodiversity conservation are estimated to be between $1.5 and $5 billion per year. So this is actually much larger than the amount of money currently going to REDD. And so some portion of this could be spent on supplemental payments for biodiversity. And this amount of money could increase further if a REDD mechanism establishes an efficient payment vehicle for forest conservation. Now, as I mentioned, there's many ways to increase the biodiversity value of REDD. My former colleague Celia Harvey and her co-authors had a very nice paper in Conservation Letters in 2010 that divided ways of promoting the biodiversity benefit from REDD into those benefits that also increased climate benefits and those that traded off at the expense of lower climate benefits. So for example, increasing finance for REDD would be good for carbon and biodiversity. Minimizing leakage to regions of low deforestation would be good for carbon and biodiversity. In contrast, a safeguard to prevent afforestation of biologically significant grasslands with fast-growing non-native timber species would be important for biodiversity, but would come at the expense of carbon, to give one example. Now, a question that I'd like to ask is, if we make these supplemental payments for biodiversity, would this help or hinder mitigation? And this is sort of a straightforward question if these supplemental payments are new and additional. In that case, it falls under increased finance for REDD, and it helps both biodiversity and climate. But what about if the amount of payments going for forest conservation are fixed, and so so the amount of money going for biodiversity payments are coming directly away from money for carbon payments? Well, surprisingly, even in this case, it can still be better for carbon. It could be better for carbon to pay, let's say, 95% of money for carbon payments and 5% of money for biodiversity payments than to pay 100% of money for carbon payments. Now, this is different from what previous authors have found. You may be familiar with these papers, and these are just two of them. Previous studies have found a trade-off between carbon and biodiversity. This is Oscar Venter and his co-authors in Science, Frank Larson and his co-authors in Conservation Letters. What both of these charts are showing are what's called a production possibility frontier. These curved lines show along one axis the benefit to species, along another axis the benefit to carbon, and the line indicates a fixed amount of funding or a fixed amount of land area, and anywhere along that line is what you could possibly get. You could get a lot of species and some carbon, or as you move along the line, you could get lots of carbon and some species. And what these are showing is carbon and biodiversity trade off against each other. It's not possible to move along the line with fixed funding and get both more carbon and biodiversity. So now this is what I'm arguing is not the full picture. These studies have left out something very important. So what have these studies left out? They've all used a very standard assumption in the conservation planning literature that every site has a fixed cost of protection. It could be the opportunity cost, and if a conservation group or a REDD mechanism is able to pay that price, then they're able to obtain that site within the network of protected forests. But this is not how REDD Plus works. REDD Plus does not pay a payment based on the opportunity cost of land. It pays a fixed price per ton of carbon emission avoided. How do we know that? Well, first we can look at the evidence from Norway's bilateral cooperation with Brazil, with the bilateral agreement with Guyana, where they pay $5 per ton of carbon. We can look at the carbon fund that's negotiating a fixed price per ton of carbon. And there's a reason why REDD is using a fixed price per ton of carbon rather than paying for the opportunity cost. There's several reasons. It could be because there's competition between multiple buyers. Could be because equity considerations constrain price discrimination. It's very hard to argue that you should pay one person $1 and pay their neighbor $2 for doing the very same thing. If payments were made for opportunity cost with no supplier surplus, there'd be no remaining incentive to conserve forest. And in some conservation programs around the world that do price discriminate, such as the Bush Tender program in Australia, they have to use quite complex mechanisms such as reverse auctions that could be very costly to develop and implement in the developing country context. So for all these reasons, there's a price per ton of carbon in REDD, not an opportunity cost payment. Now, if this is the case, which I argue that it is, and the price that's paid in red is the price per service, per ton of carbon or per biodiversity unit, then this production possibility frontier no longer is sloping downward. Instead, it bubbles outward, meaning that it's possible to shift payments from a fund of fixed size from all carbon payments to a mixture of carbon payments and biodiversity payments and result in increased carbon storage. So on the graph here, the chart moving from point B to point C is spending the same amount of money, spending that money not all on carbon, but mostly on carbon and partially on biodiversity, and getting both more biodiversity and more carbon. Another way to say this is that an incremental biodiversity payment can in some cases result in more carbon storage than an incremental carbon payment of the same size. That would be moving from point A to point C rather than point A to point B. Why? Why does this occur? The short answer is because when supplementing REDD carbon payments with biodiversity payments, the buyers could be spending less on windfalls to existing participants and more on payments to incentivize new participants to join. So let's look at the top chart. This is a carbon payment. The x-axis is each ton of carbon that could be avoided from emissions in the country. The y-axis is the price of that ton. So sequentially, each ton of carbon costs a little bit more than the last one to incentivize. And a payment is a fixed price per ton of carbon is going to have two components. What's below the curve is an opportunity cost that's paying land users or contributors to join, to contribute their emission reductions. And the shaded area above the curve is producer surplus. They're getting money above what they're willing their price to join the system. So it might cost them $2 per ton to keep land and forest instead of converting to cattle, and they're paid $5 per ton, so that's $3 additional to what they would have been getting anyway. And if they're paid $6 or if they're paid $7, they still join whether or not, and they would have joined anyway. Now, all right, moving from that diagram to the left, if the buyers wanted to increase mitigation from forests, from that landscape, they would have to do so by raising the carbon price. And that carbon price would be raised for everyone. So if the price was increased from $5 per ton to $6 per ton, that is going to bring in some new participants to the system. Let's say there are some people who need to be paid more than $5.50 per ton to join, so those people join. But it's also making payments to everyone else who already would have joined at $5 per ton. Now they're getting $6 per ton. So some portion of the additional payment for carbon goes to incentivizing new suppliers. Some portion goes to additional windfall payments to existing suppliers. Now, imagine instead this arrow going to the right. This is supplemental biodiversity payments. And it's possible that when these payments are made, a greater proportion goes to bringing in new suppliers and a lower portion goes to paying additional windfall payments to existing suppliers. And this is, in fact, exactly what we see in simulations. So I'll present here. This is just a toy landscape to give a little example so you can see with just a simple little arithmetic demonstration. And then I'll move to landscapes that are modeled for Indonesia, Bolivia, and Madagascar. So this is just imagine a very, oh, sorry, back a slide. So just imagine a very simple 6-site forest. Each site has an opportunity cost. It has a biodiversity value. It has a carbon value. And if the payment for the biodiversity and carbon is more than the opportunity cost, that site participates. If it's lower, it doesn't participate. Just a very simple example. Next slide, please. And here, imagine a carbon payment of $3 per ton of carbon. You look at site 1, there's carbon value of 15. If there's $3 per ton, that would be $45 for participating. That's more than the $15, and so site 1 participates. Let's look at site 6. The opportunity cost is $36. Carbon value of 6 times the price of $3 per ton is 18. That's less than 36. Site 6 doesn't participate. And here you can look, you can check the math. The 3 sites that would opt in to participating would be sites 1, 2, and 3. And if you add up how much is spent on those sites in carbon payments, it's $120. The total biodiversity value is 10 plus 16 plus 2, which is 28. The total carbon value is 15 plus 20 plus 5, which is 40. Now let's imagine a second scenario. $2 per ton of carbon, $1 per unit of biodiversity. We'll just call the unit B. And here, if this is the payment that's made, site 3 does not participate when it would have before, but site 4 does. So $2 for biodiversity, that's 2 times 12 is $24. $2 per ton of carbon, that's 2 times 6 is 12, plus $1 for biodiversity, 1 times 12 is 12, sum that's 24. So 24 is more than 10, site 4 participates. Here, if you add up the payments, it's still $120, same amount, but the amount of biodiversity, instead of 28, it's 38, which is not that surprising. We're paying for biodiversity now, so we're getting more of it. What is surprising is that our carbon value is gone up from 41 to 41 from 40. So by making this payment, we're actually getting more carbon as well as more biodiversity. And so I ran this simulation for 3 countries using a model that I developed earlier with co-authors for other purposes called OSIRIS in Bolivia, symbolized by the jaguar there, Indonesia with the orangutan, and Madagascar with the lemur. And you see, if you look at this dark black curve there, there's the same bubbling outward. So paying a price per ton of carbon and a price per biodiversity unit, you can actually move along the curve from a point where you're paying all for carbon to a point where you're paying some for carbon payments and some for biodiversity payments, and you get more carbon for the mixture than if you're only paying for carbon payments. And so there's a question that I thought was interesting to ask, which is, what is the sweet spot? Meaning, if you want to maximize carbon storage, and you can split how you make your payments from carbon payments and biodiversity payments, what percentage of the total payments should you spend on biodiversity in order to maximize carbon storage? And again, this is with the same amount of money, so it's not adding new money, it's keeping the funds constant. And so the simulations were run in this way. For each of these countries, we had maps of carbon density, maps of biodiversity value. So for biodiversity in Bolivia, this was actually across 17 taxa. For Indonesia, it was mammal species. For Madagascar, it was lemur species. We had maps of opportunity cost, meaning estimates of what the potential agricultural revenue is for any land if it was converted from forest to agriculture. We have maps of where deforestation occurred in the recent past. We used the same extremely simple assumption that if payment for the services exceeded the opportunity cost, that area of land would participate and conserve forest rather than deforest. And we varied the percentage of payments from 100% carbon payments and 0% biodiversity payments to 0% carbon payments, and 100% biodiversity payments, and everything in between. And so the results of the simulations for these three countries are, in Bolivia, you'd actually get the most carbon by spending 1 to 5% on biodiversity payments and 95 to 99% on carbon payments. Indonesia, you get the most carbon by spending 15 to 69% on biodiversity payments and 31 to 85% on carbon payments. In Madagascar, you get the most carbon by spending 14 to 31% of the fixed fund on biodiversity payments and the 69 to 86% on carbon payments. The range of the estimates here within countries depends on how much money there is, what level of finance total for payments, and the difference, the wide difference across countries is driven by the correlation between the where the biodiversity is and where the opportunity costs are high. So in places where the biodiversity value is more correlated with opportunity cost than carbon, the biodiversity payment gets more carbon, and in places, and so that's like Indonesia, and in places where the carbon stock is more correlated with the opportunity cost, the potential agricultural revenue, than the biodiversity value is, then paying more for carbon has a greater effect on getting carbon. So that's like Bolivia. All right. So having established that paying for biodiversity payments can benefit not only biodiversity but actually carbon, what are the implications for these different policy fora? So the UNFCCC, I would say the rules are set. There's not likely to be much change to REDD based on this, and so I'd argue just do no harm. Continue to create registries and just allow and be open to the possibility that someone could make payments through the UNFCCC REDD system for things other than carbon. Now in other systems, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility Carbon Fund, the door is not closed to forest countries participating in that fund and asking for payments for something other than carbon. Although my guess is that it's unlikely, but it would be possible for one of the participating countries to do so if they asked to. In voluntary markets, I'm not aware of any fund that's purchasing voluntary REDD carbon with a price per unit of biodiversity, but there's really nothing that I can see that would be stopping this or from stopping a matching payment to voluntary purchases. The place that I think is most promising for this type of payment to be made are national payment for ecosystem services programs like those in Costa Rica, Mexico, Ecuador, and other places. Most of these that I'm familiar with are already paying for multiple services. They're not set up in the same way as REDD, but if these programs were used as the basis for national REDD programs, they already include the precedent to consider and potentially to pay for multiple services. What are the implications for conservation groups? Well, agree to an appropriate biodiversity metric to use. And to paraphrase the saying, I know this is tricky because it's probably a case where you have 2 ecologists and 3 opinions, but I think you could agree on a metric. Consolidate demand across many potential interested funders and pay. So let's see, before I end, just briefly some limitations. Making supplemental biodiversity payments would not support conservation of non-forest species. REDD is based on forests. It wouldn't help species for which habitat loss is not the main threat, or species for which costly management is required in addition to habitat conservation. It wouldn't help species that are so uncharismatic as to not be included in the biodiversity value. And just to flag some other research I have with my former colleague Hedley Grantham, there's a lot of reasons why protected areas can do things that REDD can't. If you're interested in that, we have an article in environmental research letters that you may be interested in. So to conclude, in spite of those limitations that I mentioned, supplementing REDD with biodiversity payments is a potentially important new tool for both biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. A surprising but important finding that carbon payments plus biodiversity payments could achieve more mitigation than carbon payments only. And this could be achieved mostly by leveraging existing REDD infrastructure. Lots of time, lots of money going into developing systems for MRV, reference levels, safeguards, finance. These can all be used to make payments through the system based on biodiversity value. And so the only new investment that are needed are registries of the origin of emission reductions, a common metric of biodiversity value, and aggregation of demand to make payments. So thank you very much again to Breen, to Jenny, to WWF, and to you. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonah. That was a great presentation. So as Jonah said, at this point, we will open it up to questions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can submit your questions using the toolbar at the right, and we will jump right into the questions. And as Jonah is answering these questions, I'm just going to move to the next slide here so you can see the selected bibliography that he shared for the presentation. Again, if you're curious or looking for this presentation after the fact, I will make a PDF copy of this available, so no need to copy down all of these resources at the moment. You'll be able to see it after the fact as a PDF. So Jonah, to kick us off for our first question, let's ask you, would this work for payments for other ecosystem services as well, besides biodiversity?
Good question. Thank you. So the short answer is yes. I presented at the beginning a slide showing about 20 or so services of forests. Biodiversity is the natural service because it's the other global public good. It's the other place where demand and funding could conceivably come in from all around the world and not just regionally or locally. But payment for water services are very important for driving national or local markets for ecosystem services. And so within a country, you could set up a framework that pays for carbon, a price per ton of carbon, a price per unit of biodiversity, a price per hydrological service, and I'd expect by having 3 or more services, you'd get even more of this benefit of you're getting more of all services and not just what the one service.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll move on to the next question, and Lauren asks, can you explain the windfall idea in light of the fact that we're facing a cost overabundance of REDD credits? We have the price of REDD dropping, but can in-pipeline projects afford that? How can project developers begin to think about these ideas when there is a fundamental concern of a non-existent market for emerging projects?
Sure. So good question. So when I was talking about windfall, I'm talking about when there's a price per ton of carbon, which is what I've seen in both the voluntary and the bilateral REDD arrangements. There's some amount of that money that's going to pay above and beyond what it costs the producer to produce that emission reduction. So another term for it would be profit or rent, and this would be in any market. If you're selling shoes, if you're selling gold, there's some cost to you of producing it, and then there's a market price. And if you sell at that market price, you're presumably making some amount of profit. It's the same idea for REDD. Now, I'm not sure if this is what the question is asking, but some people have asked, why should buyers pay that profit or that windfall to the suppliers of REDD? Why can't they only pay the suppliers what it costs them and nothing more? And I presented a few reasons why I think that's difficult to do. And it's challenging to get these producers to disclose what their reservation price would be, when in fact the incentive would be for them not to tell you, and it's probably not equitable by many people's standard of equity. And if you were to do that, it would take away the incentive to participate in REDD rather than to grow beef or cattle. So for all of those reasons, it's natural that sellers or producers of REDD are paid more than what it costs them and not exactly what it costs them. And I apologize that I'm really not sure if I've captured the intent of what you're trying to ask.
Well, let's see. I can.
Maybe if you have a follow-up that.
Yes. Let's see, Lauren. If you have a follow-up, please feel free.
come back to it or something.
We can come back to Lauren. So the next question we have is, let's see. So is there a requirement to do an analysis of additionality for biodiversity payments?
Yeah, excellent question. So the way I envision it, all of the tests for additionality would already be taken care of by the existing reference level. And so you may say that's that reference level is in tons of carbon. Biodiversity is not in tons of carbon, but in order to get the reference level in tons of carbon, it's a multiplication of how much deforestation has occurred and where by how much carbon was in that forest. That's the reference level for deforestation anyway. We know it would get a little more complicated with degradation and other elements of REDD. But you could take that same rate of deforestation and multiply that by the biodiversity value of the forest that's lost, and that's the reference level you could use for making payments for biodiversity. It would not require a separate additionality mechanism on top of the existing one.
Thank you. So the next question is from William, and William asks, what is the most appropriate methodology to determine the price of a carbon/biodiversity credit? Let's start with carbon and then do biodiversity. So the price for carbon, in my mind, the most appropriate way to do this is to have a full, complete market like the European emission trading scheme. So there's many sellers of emission reductions, there's many buyers, and based on their interaction in the market, the price is determined, and it fluctuates, and at least when there was high ambition for climate action in the last period, the price was fairly robust, and we hope it gets back there again. In bilateral agreements for carbon, there seemed to be a convergence around $5 per ton of carbon with the Norway bilaterals, perhaps with the Carbon Fund as well, so that's a nice precedent. In terms of a price per unit of biodiversity, I'm not sure that there's a natural price, more than that I think anyone putting up the money would just look at how much
funding they have, how much biodiversity is out there, and to try to put forward a price per unit that they think would would both provide a good amount of incentives when supplementing REDD payments and could cover a broad portion of the landscape. So if funds are small, I'd propose starting with a small a small region or a small country in which to make these supplemental payments so that the price could be higher. And then if there's more money, then the group could either raise the price or expand to multiple places.
Great, thank you. The next question is, does a fund or does funding exist for biodiversity payments? As payments are based on performance, is there any methodology which can permit us to measure the performance of the beneficiaries before the payment?
Let's see. Are you able to show that one? So does funding exist? Not that I'm aware of. There's not currently a fund that I know of for paying supplemental payments for REDD. However, there's between $1.5 and $5 billion a year in international financial flows from rich countries to tropical countries for biodiversity conservation. A lot of that is for supporting national park systems. A lot of that goes through the Global Environmental Facility, and I'm sure all of that funding is, and that includes international groups as well, like World Wildlife Fund. And all of that money is currently going to something, so I'm not suggesting it would have to be reprogrammed, but that gives you a sense of the amount of money that's out there currently for biodiversity. It's still on an annual basis about an order of magnitude higher than what's out there for REDD. So it suggests this money could be out there. And what was the second part of that question?
The second, so Jonah, this is the one that came in via email beforehand. Yes. As well, if that's helpful. The second part is, as payment is based on the performance, is there any methodology which can permit us to measure the performance of the beneficiaries before the payment? And perhaps if it's not super clear, we can follow up afterwards with the person who asked that. Let's do that.
Yes, so, okay. So with that one, so that's, so you measure performance for carbon with emission reductions avoided, and that's subtracting two things. You're subtracting the emissions occurring during the performance period from the reference level of emissions. And so I envision exactly the same thing for biodiversity. And the amount of biodiversity achieved by the country is the amount of biodiversity loss in the performance period subtracting from a reference level of biodiversity loss. And how would that biodiversity loss be calculated? It would be the amount of deforestation multiplied by the biodiversity value of every unit of forest. It's directly comparable to the reference level for deforestation, which is the amount of deforestation multiplied by the carbon value of every unit of forest. And the so I'll reference again for things like this. There are some formulas written down that give sort of explicit numbers for how you could calculate this, and that's in the paper that's at the that's been at the bottom of the slides.
Great, thank you. And we'll make sure that the link to the paper is also in the redcommunity.org page that you get sent in the follow-up email. So the next question is, how do you see the role of CCB standards of valuing biodiversity?
So they're complementary. So the climate, community, and biodiversity standards are voluntary standards right now for voluntary carbon projects. Potentially an iteration could come along for jurisdictional or rather for for national REDD as well. And what CCB has done to date with voluntary standards are to to show that processes have been followed in not only biodiversity but also social metrics, processes about communities determining what's important and having a say in how the REDD projects or initiatives take place. What they haven't done that I'm aware of to date is to try to put an explicit value on the amount of biodiversity in each place and to differentiate the premium based on that level of biodiversity. So if you're CCB certified, you're either certified or you aren't, or maybe there's a level or two. And you can try to get a price premium in the market based on that certification. That's different from a supplemental payment that pays twice as much to a place that has twice the biodiversity value. So what I would envision would be a different organization would convene a roundtable. Let's say World Wildlife Fund convenes a roundtable, or the Convention on Biological Diversity does, and everyone agrees, all right, the best way to calculate forest biodiversity value for this purpose is just, is it primary forest or not? Or does it contain habitat, how many species, endemic forest species, does it provide habitat for? And then, based on that, the consolidators and funders would pay proportional to the value of that site. So if there's twice as many endemic forest species, the biodiversity payment would be twice as high. So that would complement CCB that says sort of everything has been done in an inclusive and pro-biodiversity way.
Great, thank you. So we have some follow-up from Lauren, who had asked our previous question, and Lauren says, I'm curious about the transition between REDD only and REDD biodiversity. In your example, you showed the price for REDD dropping, but how might that impact the REDD only projects currently underway? Thank you, Lauren, for following up on that.
Thank you for the clarification. So what's dropping is the price per ton of carbon, because remember, in the way I set it up, there's a fixed amount of funding. So if you pay more for carbon payments, you pay less for biodiversity payments. So the price of every ton of carbon goes down, but to compensate for that, there's now a price per unit of biodiversity where there wasn't before. And everywhere that is conserving forest is automatically going to be both conserving carbon and conserving biodiversity. So it's not necessarily the case that for all projects or for all contributing districts or landowners that the overall price per hectare goes down. It will go down in some places and up in other places. So this would be good for existing contributors that have high biodiversity. They might get more. It would be good for you get more contributors with high biodiversity where carbon wasn't enough, and it would come at the expense of, or there'd be a lower price to those contributors or projects that have lots of carbon and not much biodiversity. So that's I guess there's winners and losers with everything, you could say. And so, in addition to saying why don't we pay for both carbon and biodiversity, I think it's important that we also don't lose sight of the fact that we need to be increasing funding overall. There needs to be more money coming in for carbon, because we know forests are such an important contributor to stopping climate change, and there should be more money coming in for biodiversity because forests are so key to stopping the extinction crisis as well. 2/3 of all species, terrestrial species, live in tropical forests.
Great, thank you. And we'll call that our last question because we've come to the end of our time here. So thanks again to Jonah. And just before we close, I'd like to run through a few additional REDD resources here. If you'd like to follow up with any of our learning sessions, REDD Community, which I mentioned, our Resource Digest, which is a weekly update of REDD info and events, our Canopy, which is our quarterly newsletter, and then finally our website. And again, Jonah's contact information is in one of the earlier slides, but I'll make sure that it's available on the reddcommunity.org link that you receive in your follow-up email. Again, here are a few more ways to stay connected with us. And I know we do have a few more questions that we did not have time to answer, so what we'll do is we will send those to Jonah and he can write up the answers and we'll post those on REDD Community. So with that, I want to thank you again. A big thanks to Jonah for presenting for us today, and thanks to everyone who joined us. And with that, I'll bring us to a close, and we hope to see you at the next learning session. Thank you, Jonah, and thank you, everyone else. Goodbye.
Thank you, Breen.
Bye.